Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this meeting of Babergh District Council Cabinet. I'm Councillor John Ward, leader of Babergh District Council, and I'll be chairing this meeting. May I remind you of some domestic arrangements? Please ensure that microphones are turned off when not in use. Please do not interrupt other speakers or hold separate conversations whilst others are speaking. If you are attending the meeting to speak and persistently interrupt the meeting, you may be asked to leave. Please ensure your mobile phones are on silent or switched off. And finally, we will be using e-voting for this meeting on the modern.gov app, so please could members make sure they are logged in and ready to use the app. I would like to remind everyone present that this meeting will be broadcast live to the internet and will be capable of repeated viewing. The whole of the meeting will be filmed, except where there are confidential or exempt items. If you make a representation to the meeting, you will be deemed by the Council to have consented to being filmed. By entering this meeting as a speaker, you are also consenting to being recorded by the Council and to the possible use of those images and sound recordings for webcasting and or training purposes. The Council, members of the public and the press may record, film, photograph or broadcast this meeting when the public and the press are not lawfully excluded. I'll now move to the agenda. So, item 1, apologies for absence.
Thank you, Chair. We have received apologies from Councillor Malvesi.
Thank you. Item 2, to receive declarations of pecuniary, other registrable or non-registrable interests by members. Does anyone? Councillor Osborne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm declaring a non-pecuniary in the cost of living report and action plan, as it does refer to the CA, and I'm a trustee on that particular board in Suffolk.
Thank you. Right, moving on to item 3. Oh, sorry, Councillor Busby, sorry.
Yeah, I guess I probably ought to declare something or other as a director of Babergh Growth, which is promoting the HQ redevelopment. But I have signed a dispensation form which hopefully will allow me to speak.
I'll ask the monitoring officer to confirm that, please.
Thank you, Chair. Councillors, you need to refer to the new regime of interests under the new Code of Conduct. So there isn't a category of local non-pecuniary anymore. Councillor Busby, you have got a dispensation that allows you to participate in discussions about the HQ site, so you're fine. Councillor Osborne, if you've got an other registrable interest or a non-registrable interest which you need to disclose, that will prevent you from voting and participating in the item.
Sorry, so clarification, where does that leave me on that particular report? It's just that it refers to the CA because they're relevant to the cost of living crisis. So where does that leave me on that one? Do I withdraw my declaration or? Yes. Okay. Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I withdraw that declaration.
That's okay. That's understandable. That the regulations have changed somewhat, and so we're all getting used to them. Okay, then, that's great. Thanks. So, moving on to item 3, that's paper BCA 21-1 to confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 4th of April 2022. They're on pages 5 to 10 of your agenda pack. So just quickly going through, if anyone can stop me as I go through, on page 5, page 6, page 7, page 8, page 9, and finally page 10. If no one has any comments, may I have a proposer, please? Councillor Osborne, thank you. And a seconder? Councillor Arthey, thank you. Right, that's great. So we need to take a vote on that.
Yes, thank you, Chair. The vote is now in progress. Chair, that is 6 votes for and 1 abstention.
Thank you. Right, next item is item 4, to receive notification of petitions in accordance with the Council's petition scheme.
None received, Chair.
Item 5, questions by councillors.
None received.
Thank you. And item 7, matters referred by the Overview and Scrutiny or Joint Audit and Standards Committees.
There are no matters referred.
Thank you. Item 7, the forthcoming decisions list. Does any member of the Cabinet have any comments or questions relating to the forthcoming decisions list? No? Excellent, thank you. Right, we'll move on to the first of the main items of this afternoon's meeting. That's item 8, which is paper BCA 22.2, which is our response to National Grid's non-statutory consultation on the East Anglia Green Overhead Line project. I'll now invite the Cabinet Member for Planning to introduce the report. Councillor Arthey.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, paper BCA 22.2 provides you with the proposed response. You have all attended the briefings, as have many of the affected ward councillors, and I would like to thank Bron Curtis for coordinating those for us. She's not here today, so Tom Barker is. Maybe you could pass on, please, those thanks to Bron for those briefings that she's done. You will be aware of the concerns regarding impact on heritage, landscape and quality of life that would affect our residents and the growing number of visitors to both Babergh and Mid-Suffolk. Our overriding preference is for a coordinated offshore approach to minimise onshore infrastructure and the associated impact on our communities and the environment. Subsea cabling options are being developed for the north of England and Scotland, so why not here? In the absence of a subsea alternative, I'm proposing we object to the current EA Green proposals. Mid-Suffolk Cabinet have already met and agreed the recommendation to object, and in the strongest possible terms. Chairman, I move the recommendations in section 3 and ask for a seconder. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Arthey. May I have a seconder? Councillor Busby. Thank you. I have also invited ward members to attend this meeting today to present their responses to the consultation, and they will be allowed to speak once for 3 minutes, and this will be timed. Now, I also have Councillor Carpendale's written submission, and that's there in your table papers. I will read that out now for anyone viewing this meeting. So this is the response received from Councillor Sue Carpendale, who is the ward member for Capel St Mary. And she's unable to be present today. I can't offer you any expertise, but my comments reflect my own views and those of residents in my ward. I know that some of these residents will be making their own very substantial and well-argued objections direct to the consultation. I'm completely supportive of their objections. I attended the consultation event and exhibition at Holton St Mary on the 17th of May 2022 and requested further information, including a set of maps. The event was busy, with many people present. As one might have expected, I didn't hear one positive comment. The proposed corridor for these massive 50-metre pylons passes along the edge of my ward. Needless to say, nearby residents are horrified and alarmed by the prospect. However, the proximity of these pylons is not just an issue for people living close by. The maps illustrating the 180-kilometre pylon corridor from Norfolk to Essex demonstrate the appalling intrusion into the area, both visually and in terms of land use and disturbance. I do not believe that undergrounding a short section through the AONB is either sufficient or acceptable, given the impact on the environment, including wildlife and natural habitat. I'm wholly supportive of the lobby gaining traction at levels from our regional MPs at Westminster through to local residents that a supply network of this magnitude should be routed subsea and river in its entirety. If France can ship power to the UK across the channel, the technology clearly exists. Furthermore, in view of the number of power cuts suffered as a result of weather-related events, and in a time of climate change when there is a likelihood of more frequent and severe weather events, it surely does not make sense to erect such an important, long-term and strategically significant power supply in a manner which will not guarantee continuity of operation. This proposal is a monstrous imposition on rural East Anglia and dismissive of alternative supply route technologies. So that was from Councillor Carpendale. What I will do, first of all, I'll ask members if they have any questions present, and then if any other members, and I know Councillor Hidden probably wants to say a few words. So first of all, I'll go to members of the Cabinet. Does anyone have any questions on this report as it stands before we go into debate? Nope. Okay. Councillor Hinton, would you like to say something?
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. Yes, this proposal is, as Councillor Carpendale has pointed out in her written submission, is extremely intrusive across a wide swathe of the countryside from Norfolk all the way down through into Essex. It chomps through the parts of my ward and across the Stour Valley, and it will be extremely intrusive, more intrusive than the existing power network that is already in place. We know that these networks are vulnerable to weather conditions. We saw a few years ago a lightning strike on a gas-powered power station in Bedfordshire that blacked out the whole of northern East Anglia and Ipswich Hospital for the simple reason that it then tripped out a wind farm. So even having wind farms off the coast, it's not a reliable source when there is a storm around or anything like that. Putting energy that's generated off the coast under sea is a logical way to proceed. There are already proposals within this for part of it to be put under the sea round to Tilbury. So why on earth can't the whole thing be put under sea from the start of the operation up in off the North Norfolk coast? We know that in the possible near future, there's going to be a third nuclear reactor at Sizewell. That will presumably mean that they're going to have to put up some more pylons to take the power from Sizewell to where it's actually needed. And that will mean further intrusion upon the coast, the countryside of Suffolk and North Essex. We know also that within the plans, I hasten to say, strategic thinking that the government has got in place, because it doesn't seem to have an awful lot of strategic thinking as far as power generation is concerned, that the new mini nuclear reactors, if they ever get off the ground, will be placed near to where the electricity is going to be consumed, and that will reduce on transmission costs and transmission losses. So putting something underground or undersea now will give positive benefits for the long term for the whole of East Anglia, which at the moment is turning into an enormous great pylon farm. So I support very much the objections of the council to the overgrounding of the pylon erection of these proposals.
Thank you, Councillor Hinton. We have a report in front of us which actually tries to achieve, and I think achieves very well, two things. Firstly, of course, it provides a direct response to the consultation on the technical aspects of the proposal, which is to be welcomed, because there are certain issues we have with the proposal as it stands, should it eventually go forward, and there's some useful suggestions to changes that can be made to that. But the other thing, of course, is to express our opposition to this particular solution when there are other solutions available, or potentially available. So, does any Cabinet members, would anyone like to comment on this report? Councillor McCraw.
Only to say that it's a very complete report, and I don't think there's a single thing that you would want to be included that has been missed. Obviously, I'm very pleased to see that the biodiversity for the Catawade marshes has been included, and it could actually easily have been argued that that was a distance away, but in fact it's not, because it's literally anything that affects the environment is not just a matter of you've got to be on the spot. A little bit down the road does matter. So I commend the report. I think it's a good response, and I can see that it was passed successfully by Mid-Suffolk. I can't see any reason for us to do anything different.
Thank you, Councillor McCraw. I actually have a couple of points that I'd like to make myself, actually, on the content, and some suggested additions which I've already relayed to Bron. Firstly, on the recommendations, the second recommendation, that the Assistant Director for Planning and Building Control, in collaboration with Cabinet members for planning, consider any proposed amendments. That should also include the two council leaders, as the report will eventually be sent on behalf of Susie and myself. So if we could have that added to the recommendation.
Did you want me to comment on that, Chairman?
Yeah, okay, if you will.
Yeah, it's what Mid Suffolk did. They said that that the response should be authorised for Tom in consultation with the leader as well as the cabinet member for planning, and it would make sense for us to do exactly the same. So that would be adding you as leader to the cabinet member bit.
Thank you, Councillor Arthey. So as proposer, you're happy with that. Councillor Busby, as seconder, are you happy with that? Yeah. Thank you. The next point I wanted to make is on page 16 of the report. And that is in the paragraph, or prior to the paragraph that says in the absence of greater clarity around the options, and following on from the paragraph referring to the undersea cabling for the north of England and Scotland. There's another paragraph that I wanted to add in between those two, which states that, and I'll read it out, the councils are concerned that National Grid decided prior to this consultation to choose a land route for ATNC rather than a viable undersea route, SED2. There is a lack of transparency about how and why the recommendation for SED2 was changed to stop in NOAA 2020 to 21 after it had initially been assessed as viable. This decision should not have been made without public consultation. And just to add some clarification around that, SED1 is currently a subsea link between East Anglia and Kent that has been approved. There was going to be a second undersea route, SED2, to replace the southern section of East Anglia Green, the Bramford to Tilbury section, which is known as ATNC. That second route, SED2, was included in what National Grid called their NOAA, the Network Operations Assessment, or something like that. I think that's what it's called. I'll just clarify that for a moment. Network Options Assessment. So it was in that prior to 2020 to 21, but suddenly, because it was assessed as viable, but suddenly in 2020 to 21, it was reclassified as stopped. And there wasn't any real clarity over that. So I think we need to have a sentence or paragraph here to that effect. I don't know what people think about that.
I don't mind that. I've been looking at Tom Barker. I don't know if you've provided him with that text ahead of
Bron has it.
Today, have you?
Bron has it.
Bron has it. Okay. So if we approve the recommendation today, Tom will be able to add that and anything else that's necessary to beef up our response and strengthen our objection. Yeah. Okay. Yep.
The other thing, there was another one which I wanted to include. Oh, that's right, yes. On page 20, at the bottom of page 20, when it talks about the ceiling end the cable ceiling end compounds, and looking at alternative locations, one clear alternative location for that, for the northern end of the AOMB ceiling end compound, is the Notley Enterprise Park at Raydon, and it might be worth highlighting that, Tom, if we could. And I think that's it from my point of view. Does anyone else have any comments on this?
I am mindful, Chairman, that that comment is sort of trying to make an option that we're not supporting acceptable.
No, well,
obviously, the main thrust of our objection is that we don't like the overground. Underground would be better, but we don't like that either. And what we want to see is subsea.
Yeah.
But if you're happy to leave that to Tom to agree with Bron, it'll come back to you and to me before it's sent off.
I think that makes sense. But certainly, I take your point about indicating that we might find this acceptable or not. But there's lots of other suggestions in the technical response to the consultation that this naturally fits in with, so that, which is why I suggested it. But we'll look at it and along with the other things in detail. But in terms of the overarching principle that we should be looking at, or we should be asking National Grid to look at a more strategic offshore route and support very much Sir Bernard Jenkins' offset task force, which he has set up to lobby Parliament to that effect, to lobby ministers rather to that effect. That is clearly what all of us wish to see, isn't it? Does anyone, Councillor Busby?
Yeah, I kind of agree with Clive on the comment. I think the danger is once you start putting in suggestions as to how they can improve their overhead lines, it almost implies that you're resigned to that as an outcome. And I don't think we should be. I think we should be stressing, as far as we're concerned, there is only one outcome, and that is a subsea. We should be resisting every industrialisation of our countryside that we can. This is not what we're known for. We are a rural countryside, we're rural counties. People come to see us, the tourists come to see us for that. People live here because of that. They don't live here because they could be close to a pylon. And we should resist it with all strength, even stronger objection than in Suffolk, in my view.
Thank you, Councillor Busby. And I think it's disappointing that Bays and Ofgem have not tasked National Grid to look in more detail and with more regard to subsea options, and indeed to join up all of these requirements around the country into a fully strategic grid offshore. Councillor McCraw.
Yeah, I'd support Councillor Arthey and Councillor Busby's point on that seeming acceptance by proposing an alternative. I think we're better to have a stronger and more coherent argument. I'd rather not see us weaken that argument.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Osborne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have read this, and it is rather concerning, and I know many of our residents are really concerned about this, and we do need to be very robust in our response. And I absolutely agree with Councillor Busby. If you make that comment, it does appear that we're supporting the overhead cables, and I don't think that's the way forward. But otherwise, I agree to the recommendations with the amendments that have been suggested today. And I do hope that this will help our residents feel a little bit more assured that we're onto this, as are many others, to make sure that the right approach is taken. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Osborne. Councillor McLaren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I just want to confirm what my colleagues have said on the Cabinet. I think Councillor Busby's comment about tourism being one of our major industries, especially on the east side of Babergh. And at the moment, tourism is in a poor state, and we don't want people to be put off from coming to our bit of the world because we rely on their income and their support. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor McCraw.
This might be a late technical question, perhaps Tom would be able to answer it, but I note this is a non-statutory pre-application consultation. Does that give the National Grid more options, fewer options, or do they eventually have to go to a statutory consultation? Just asking.
Yes, if they chose to take it to the next stage, then that would be a statutory consultation. So this is essentially a public pre-application.
Can I just say, Chairman, I think that actually reinforces the importance of getting in early and saying exactly what we think, rather than sort of beating about the bush, and that is that we want subsea, we don't like overhead, we don't like overhead with burying of some cables, because that has an impact on our landscape and our communities as well. What we want is subsea. And I think getting in early with that view, saying that that should be properly explored, is the right way to start.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think also that this particular issue does need to be clarified with a matter of urgency, because at the moment there is increasing blight caused by this proposal on many of our residents, because the corridor is quite wide in places, and a large number of people are currently potentially impacted by it in terms of their well-being, as well as their house price values, which inevitably will get impacted by it. And it's causing a lot of people a lot of upset and anguish. So this particular issue must be resolved as soon as possible to set their minds straight. So if there are no further comments by members of the Cabinet, then we'll move to the vote on this, please.
Thank you, Chair. The vote is now in progress. Thank you. That is 7 votes for. That's unanimous, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, now moving on, the next item is item 9, paper BCA 22-3, the Cost of Living Report and Action Plan. I'll now invite the Cabinet Member for Communities and Wellbeing to introduce the report. So, Councillor McLaren, and before Councillor McLaren speaks, I'd just like to remind everyone that the actual report follows on from the detailed papers, so it's in a bit of a reverse order today for this one. Councillor McLaren.
Mr. Chairman, I think this is my maiden speech. I'm not quite sure about that. I don't need to stand. Thank you very much. That's very kind. I'm very proud to be presenting the cost of living paper. In recent months, members have been involved in discussions in how the district should respond to the cost of living crisis. National and local reports indicate that the impact is very real for our residents and our staff, and is likely to become more challenging in the months ahead. The proposed cost of living 5-point plan recognises that focusing on cost of living issues alone will not mitigate against the health impacts across our communities, and believe a focus on wellbeing is also required. Therefore, as described in the Cabinet report, the proposed plan focuses on 2 things. Number 1, to provide support and advice to deal with the cost of living issues, and to make sure that the government support gets to those who need it, such as household support grant, warm homes discount, and various other grants. We've got to make sure that we exercise discretion and provide welfare support and advice to those who actually need it, making best use of the data available to us, and keeping an eye on trends such as monitoring direct debit cancellations, council tax and rent arrears, free school meal numbers, and continued close working with our local citizen advice service. We must make sure we are aligned with our partners across Suffolk so that we can continue to influence the system and the support available. This might also include the development of campaigns, initiatives and incentives focusing on debt management, energy efficiency, and making sure our residents are aware of support and grants available to them. And the second part of our focus is to support people to maintain and take responsibility for their own well-being. And at Babergh, this is an area that we have already invested in, both from a strategic and a financial perspective. And therefore, we are in a good position to continue our efforts to ensure that everyone has good health and well-being. We will continue to deliver activities that focus on maintaining good health, whether that will be referrals for mental health support, discounts at our gyms and swimming pools, and engaging in community-led wellbeing initiatives, volunteering and socialising via local initiatives. We need to look at events that bring people and communities together that will support mental health and wellbeing, and we need to build community resilience. We will be, as we already do, working alongside communities through our locality roles, encouraging our communities to engage in as many positive activities as possible, from community cuppa events, frailty programmes to ASB initiatives. We will continue to focus on access to food and nutrition, whether that be participating in healthy eating exercises and initiatives, organising a community garden to grow produce, setting up community pantries, or providing extra support to local food banks to meet any unmet need. And it's about making sure we encourage the best use of initiatives such as holiday activities and food programme for children during holidays, and ensuring that the free holiday clubs have a positive impact on children and young people. I'm very impressed with the family park cooking initiative. One of the programmes we are hoping to explore as part of the plan is the development of a community leadership programme that will focus on a small number of pilots to bring people and stakeholders together to decide, design and deliver local initiatives. It is important to note that a significant amount of the activities and initiatives listed in this 5-point plan are a reflection of all the things that we in Babergh have been doing well in supporting our residents internally and with partners. Therefore, the ask in responding to the crisis is not about creating a whole new set of initiatives, but rather about making systems work better together, to share intelligence, develop our collective capacity to respond and act. And this plan does precisely this. I would also like to add, Chair, that I am particularly looking forward to establishing a cost of living coordinator, which will continue to build on the substantial operations we already have in place, including customer services, housing and welfare support, and external partnerships to ensure that partners are talking to each other in meeting people's needs. Finally, Chairman, I would just like to remind, as this is a public meeting, I feel it's important to remind people what the 5-point plan is. It's about coordinating government support, exercising discretion when providing welfare support and advice, maximising partnership working and establish systems to provide targeted support in localities, and if we are to prevent further crisis, we maintain good health and make sure that people have access to good food and nutrition. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm approving the recommendations in the report of 3.1 and 3.2, and I'm looking for a seconder. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McLaren. Thank you. Seconded. Councillor O'Croy, you wish to second? Thank you. We'll just wait while some extra people settle in the meeting. Yeah, thank you, Councillor McLaren. It is an excellent report we have in front of us today. It's been proposed and seconded. Does anyone have any questions, first of all? Councillor Osborne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, actually, I really welcome this report and the approach. I just hope it works in practice as well as it does in theory. That's my concern. And I have always been a strong advocate for early intervention and prevention, so I do welcome this. My questions is, can I be assured that there is going to be no duplication in this work being done? If I could just use, for an example, in the housing team, we already have a financial inclusion support team where we provide support across all tenures, not just our own tenants, where we provide support with maximum benefit, charitable gifts, applications for discretionary housing payments, food on fuel vouchers and advice. And we're actually currently recruiting an additional officer to this team to help that out. So that's one question, that there won't be duplication. And the other one is, can we be assured that this will be monitored to see the effectiveness of the approach that we're taking with this? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Osborne. Councillor McLaren.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Councillor Osborne, I can reassure you that duplication would be a terrible thing. because it would mean many residents would miss out. But we have, as you know, I'm new to this portfolio, and so we're planning on having regular updates and monitoring throughout the programme. And this is only phase 1. This is just the beginning, okay? But I'm assured from, we haven't got an assistant director at the moment, but the corporate manager for communities, that we will be monitoring this all the way through the programme. Thank you.
So can I come back?
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor. In regards to the monitoring, can those reports come to Cabinet on a regular basis, please?
I am sure that's possible, Councillor Osborne.
Thank you. Councillor Arthey.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree with Councillor Osborne about the monitoring. And the reason for that is that this is not so much direct action from us. It's more about support for various other initiatives. If you actually look at the 5-point plan, I've picked out the words coordinating, exercising discretion, partnership working, community-led initiatives, local initiatives, and providing support. So in a situation like that, where we haven't actually got anything direct that we're doing that we can measure, it's really, really important that we actually monitor what we're achieving, what we're doing and where. Yeah?
Thank you, Councillor Arthey.
Can I reply to that?
Yes, Councillor
Mr.
McLaren.
Chairman. Thank you, Councillor Arthey. Well, I can assure you, as a new Cabinet member for this portfolio, I am amazed at what we as a district are actually doing towards this. Some of this sounds about partners and dissipating the responsibility, but I am so impressed with what people, the staff that I've met and what they're doing already in relation to the nutrition and activity. So I can assure you it will not just be sort of spread across a lot of agencies and partners.
I think the point that Councillor Osborne was making that I was supporting was that it's actually really important to come back and give us some sort of feedback on what we've achieved and where and how.
I quite agree, Chair. We will be back with regular reports, and I myself will be involved with the producing those reports. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Because we are straying into debate now, so if there are no further questions, does anyone wish to contribute to the debate? Councillor Busby.
Well, both.
Both. Okay.
In one. Yes, it's great words, and I fully support them. It's the practical aspects that I'm interested in, what we actually can see we can do. And this is really a question for Tom. We talked about the community gardens. Will it have an impact on what we can decide on planning applications if a developer puts forward a community garden or not, or if the village, parish want a community garden in somewhere and the developer won't allow that? Will we have teeth?
Thank you, Councillor Busby. It would be, I think both of those things would be material considerations that an officer through a delegated decision or a planning committee would be able to have regard to. Quite how sharp your teeth would be, I think would be open to question and would need to be weighed in the balance against other considerations and plan-led approach. So you've already got policies within your existing planning documents and within your emerging planning documents that support this approach to open space and growing of food. So you have some teeth. As I say, how sharp they are compared to things like affordable housing or other infrastructure and those kind of things, as with all planning decisions, it would need to be weighed in the round.
Thank you. Does anyone else wish to make any comments? If not, it's just one thing I wanted to just draw attention to. Under the partnership working, there's a reference to the Suffolk public sector leaders and the £1 million funding that we have provided. Just a quick bit of background. This is to cover three things really: the Suffolk Advice and Support Service, Local Welfare Support Service, and food banks. And there's going to be very detailed monitoring of that and reporting back on a regular basis to Suffolk public sector leaders as to how that £1 million is being spent. And that all ties in with very much what we're trying to achieve here, and indeed all of our other districts and boroughs in the county as well. Does anyone else wish? Councillor Busby.
Yeah, kind of going back onto the practical thing, food banks. Do we, and I probably ought to know the answer to this question, do we publicise on our website the location of all food banks within a district? If not, why not? Do we do anything in terms of going out to food suppliers to try and encourage them to donate to these food banks? Do the food banks tell us what they're short of, what they need? Is there something a little more practical than saying we'll be monitoring food banks?
I personally don't have answers to those. Vicky, are you able to pick up on that?
Yes, thank you for that, Chairman. We are working very closely with public health, and there's a piece of work, like as you've said already, through public health and Community Action Suffolk are looking at supporting food banks. We also have close contact with our food banks, and we're aware of the relationships they already have with supermarkets, for example, who do donate significantly to the food banks. And from the local food banks we're in contact with, there isn't a significant issue at the moment with food supply. But we also know that in public health they are looking at, rather than supporting food banks individually, there is a piece of work taking place to look at how we can support food banks as a collective in terms of that support from the supermarkets directly into those food banks. So that's being looked at the moment. But certainly we are already having those conversations and have been since early days of the pandemic.
Thank you, Vicky. Anything else from anyone? Councillor Arthey.
Yeah, I've just had a look on Google, and it would appear that Suffolk County Council has a list of food banks in the county, and it would appear that we've put something on Facebook about Fork and Kitchen Deli for free cookery classes. But other than that, I can't actually find very much. So I think Councillor Busby's point is a good one. And while I'm talking, he was mentioning what else we could do, I think, with regard to planning. And I think a fairly good example of that is communities that may not have allotments. And I've had experience of it in Cockfield, where we were able to help them with a sill bid. And they actually bought land, and they're currently establishing allotments, which is conveniently located to the new development of 50 or so houses. So there are things that we can do, and that just goes back to why the monitoring is so important, because we're not actually buying ourselves an allotment and running it for a community, but we are very much involved in the way that they fund it, the way that they achieve it, the way that they secure the land. And so if we're involved in that, it's important that we know what we've done, because it's not going to show up in our budget next year. It's to do with a post that's working with communities to achieve things. And so we need to know what they've achieved and where.
Thank you. Councillor McCraw.
I've got a number of points as seconder of the motion. I might want to keep them for the end of debate. But in that case, if we're going for the end of the debate, I would just try and sum up a few things as a seconder, unless somebody else wishes to speak. Jane?
Thank you. I think I can perhaps phrase it as a question, I'm not sure. We've got, on the Shotley Peninsula, quite a lot of village pantries, and I'm sure that the rest of you have got that sort of thing as well. So it is right down at grassroots level, isn't it, that these things are happening, not necessarily always under the umbrella of the local authority. And so incredibly difficult to mark all of these small little food pantries in sort of Harkston, Durton, etc. So a very difficult thing to monitor. And I just want to echo the cause for robust monitoring. And I suppose my question would be perhaps one that is maybe in a bit more detail than we need now, but how are we going to monitor? It's all very well to be given the assurances that it's going to be robustly monitored, but how is that going to happen? And how are we going to incorporate all of these little food pantries in our wards? There are apps, aren't there, to go on to, I'm struggling to phrase this as a question. There are apps where food can be allocated, and so some kind of, here's the question, is it possible to have some kind of advertising and marketing on the website with the apps as well that aren't necessarily local authority ones? Question about allotments that Councillor Arthur just made me think. Pleased that there are more allotments, but we do see a lot of allotments that actually aren't being tilled. So possibly, is there a way that we can do some monitoring of this as well and make sure that all the allotments there are tilled and being made good use of? Thank you.
Shall I?
Yeah, yes, Councillor McLaren. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, this concern about monitoring, I think with Vicky, have got to set the monitoring standards that we want to achieve. And as this paper has got to be approved, we can start as soon as possible, because that's important, that you are satisfied that I mean, it's back to perhaps overview and scrutiny would like to take it on, but monitoring that you monitoring us to make sure that we're doing our job properly and reaching the needs. And of course, this is about people. This is not a theory. This is about meeting the needs of real people out there in our communities. So all I can do at this stage is reassure members that we will provide evidence of our monitoring, which will be very regular. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks for that, Councillor McLaren. Before I go to Councillor McCraw, just one point I'd like to say myself. I think what we have here is an action plan that is incredibly comprehensive, and I think is going to enable us to provide an excellent response, because it doesn't just look at what we can alleviate in terms of helping people through the cost of living crisis, but equally we're addressing the prevention of crisis, and that's far more important, not just for the immediate acute problems, but also longer term, to allow people to live better lives going forward. So I think this is going to have a huge impact beyond just the immediate cost of living crisis. Councillor McCraw, did you want to say a few words before we go to the vote?
Yes, and I think it's just to put it into summary, really, because I think it's important to focus on the fact that this is a 6-month action plan. It is our initial response to a situation which is likely to change further in the course of the next 18 months or even longer. We hope it'll be 18 months, shall we say. And this is one of the last pieces of work carried out by Nadine before he left us, and I'm sure Vicky will be able to provide me with a background on some of these things. But I think the important point to note here is that the 6-month timescale precludes to some extent some of the points raised in terms of involvement of planning at a policy level. We are talking about 6 months, the time at which we do that. The chance of planting allotments within 6 months or getting allotments within 6 months is also slightly precluded. But this action plan is building on existing and enhancing the pre-existing work, as was referred to by Councillors McLaren and Osborne. These programmes are in place. I know the housing team from my years of experience on the council to do what they do. I know the communities team have programmes already in place. So we are not just starting from scratch. And we know that, when particularly on point 1, when it comes to enhancing or making sure that government support is maximised and used best, well, from our experience of working with COVID, we know we can do that because we've done it very successfully in the past. And it's quite likely that the Chancellor is going to have to introduce more support, and it's quite possible that he will need to use the district councils as the means of supplying that support. We are an obvious conduit to get money where it's needed, because we are on the ground, we know the people who need it, and we're a great deal more flexible than a national government can ever be. Another couple of points, we talked about food banks and citizens' advice were mentioned. Well, I think that's an important point. The report does refer to the fact that citizens' advice in Sudbury, and I believe in Ipswich as well, do coordinate the food bank availability across our part of the district and those two CAs that we support financially. We are getting a cost of living coordinator, and obviously I've heard people say, well, that's another officer. This is being funded by the Department of Levelling Up and Housing and whatever else is on the agenda for the day. But let's just call it Levelling Up. And so this is already being funded from central government. We would be foolish not to take use of it. We support citizens' advice. There is a natural synergy with citizens' advice. I had long discussions with Nadine whilst this was being prepared. We support CA because it is doing similar jobs to ourselves. All our officers and all our departments know that. So I don't think we can argue anymore that this needs to be put through, but we have to bear in mind that this is step one, and the monitoring will come as a constant evolving process. And then we'll go into step two at the end of this year. And I would say by the end of this year, we're likely to be re-examining this ready for 2023. So I commend the recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor McCraw. All very valid points, particularly the one about government using local authorities as a conduit for distributing financial support. But COVID has certainly proved that local authorities not only can do it, but are best placed to do that. The success of the financial support through COVID was primarily down to the fact that local authorities around the country responded very quickly and very efficiently. So, but thanks for all the points you've raised. If there are no further comments from anyone, then we'll move to the vote. Oh, sorry, Councillor Beer. We did have questions earlier.
I thought this is where we could question before you take the vote.
Well, we move from questions into debate, but I'll take a question now. Go on.
Thank you. It's just one question and observation. In Great Cornard, we're setting up a food bank, you could call it, which myself and others are involved in getting this up and running. And it's not as straightforward as you think, but you did say that there's money available where needed. I think it was your words. Will you be able to offer any assistance to any groups that are starting up in areas? Is there an officer that's dedicated to help in this field? Because they have to have food hygiene checks and things like that, certificates. So there is a lot of involvement, and I think in answer to Councillor Gould's question about allotments, certainly in Great Cornard, there's very few allotments that are not being used. So I think that's another area where encouragement should be given. But really, I just wanted to know that, you know, how do we access some of this help? Thank you.
Councillor McLaren.
Thank you, Councillor Beer. If you leave that with me, I will get back to you.
Fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Okay. There are no further questions or points. We'll move to the vote, please.
Thank you, Chair. The vote is now in progress. That's 7 votes for. That's unanimous.
Thank you. Next, item 10, paper BCA 22-4, the Babergh former headquarters development site. The Cabinet Member for Assets and Investments is also on the board of Babergh Growth, and consequently, I'll be introducing this report instead of him. I know we're all keen for the development of the former HQ site in Hadley to commence at the earliest opportunity after the unavoidable delays that the project has suffered, and this report sets out how we can achieve this. The development will provide 57 new homes and represent a major investment for Hadley. It was important that we took the time required to find the best possible solution for the local community and the neighbouring cricket club. But we now find ourselves in a particularly challenging period of rapidly increasing costs, supply chain issues and uncertainty within the construction industry due to a combination of factors, including Brexit, the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. Having considered the options for this site as presented in today's report carefully, including a sale, alternative schemes and phasing, I strongly believe that the best way to ensure that this development is brought forward is to increase the debt threshold for Babergh Growth Limited to deliver the planned high-quality development of Phase 1. This is not about increasing the bill for the taxpayer, but purely to do with cash flow during the phasing of the project and the governance around the amount Babergh Growth Limited can borrow to deliver it. Ultimately, the development is still expected to break even or even show a modest profit for the council, with new homes and investment for Hadley, but only if we can release the cap to borrowing that was imposed based on cost estimates and phasing from 4 years ago. Current construction market conditions are such that decisions need to be taken and acted upon promptly, as prices will only be held for a limited period, with raw materials and subcontractor prices changing daily. The current price is fixed until Friday this week. If Cabinet support the increase to the peak debt threshold today, Babergh Growth Limited will be able to secure the contract this week, which will enable works to commence later this summer. This is an important site and one that we must support in being brought forward for development at the earliest opportunity to deliver housing and support the economic prosperity of Hadley. I am therefore pleased to propose the recommendations at section 3 of this report, and I'd like to ask for a seconder, please. Councillor Oswald, thank you. Firstly, Cabinet members, does anyone have any questions on the report in front of us? No, in which case, other members present, does anyone have any questions? And I will ask you to make sure it is just a question, please. Councillor Beer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's to do with the planning side of it, Mr. Chairman. Why has Phase 1 now been split into Phase 1 and Phase 2A? And Phase 2B, which we know as the car parking site area, is now deemed to be in a flooding zone. Why has all this now suddenly come forward? Why have you split them? And can you go ahead with this without taking that back to full council to see whether that's how they want it all split up? A bit complicated, but it's complicated reading, I'm afraid.
I understand the question. Councillor Arthey, do you have any comments from a planning perspective? Or if not, then I ask Emily.
I don't think so. I mean, it's not a planning issue regarding the phasing. I think the question was why have we now effectively got 3 phases when previously we had 2? And I think Emily's probably the best person to answer that question.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Beer, for that question. So that's fine, don't worry. So in relation to the phases, it was always planned to undertake the refurbishment work as Phase 1. So that's the refurbishment and redevelopment of the existing buildings. And for the new build to form the second phase, we've looked at Phase 2, and we can see there are some advantages in bringing forward Phase 2A. Yeah, so we can see there are some advantages in bringing forward Phase 2A at a slightly earlier opportunity than Phase 2B. So there hasn't really been a significant shift in terms of phasing. We always envisaged there being 2 main phases, the one being the redevelopment and refurbishment of the existing buildings and the second phase being new build. What I've said within the report is that we will review Phase 2 in further detail as we progress Phase 1. So that's both Phase 2A and 2B, but probably, 2B is the one that probably will need to be reviewed in further detail. In terms of planning, we have the sufficient planning in place to progress Phase 1 and Phase 2 as currently designed. But the intention is to progress with Phase 1, which will bring forward the delivery of those refurbished, redeveloped buildings.
Why did you split it? Because is Phase 2A now being flooded as well as Phase 2B? Is that the reason? Because you split the Phase 1 into 2 parts. And I just want to know, is it because that part is a flood zone area or not?
So there have been some changes to the flood zone since the original planning consent was granted. We can deliver the existing planning consent with the changes to the flood zone allocation. We are saying within this report that we will review phase 2B, and that will take into account the changes to the flood zone allocation since the planning consent was granted. There is a difference between 2A and 2B in terms of how it's regarded from a flood perspective.
Thank you, Councillor Beer. Councillor Holt.
Yeah, as a director of the holding company, I was a bit surprised to see the papers come through with 2A on, because as a director of the holding company, that's the first time I've ever seen it. So I'm a bit surprised at that. We've always had phase 1 and phase 2, which has been quite clear. But to suddenly have a phase 2A concerns me. As I say, as a director of the holding company, I was not aware of that prior to seeing these papers. It concerns me greatly of the viability of the whole scheme. The scheme has always been based upon the 2 phases and phase 2 generating a profit and a return for the council of its investment. What we have now, to me, is we've put ourselves in a position where we're up against the wall, we're up against a time frame, and we've got to vote this rise in the peak threshold through to enable the contract to be granted and the scheme to be delivered. What worries me is that is there true viability in this scheme? Without phase 2, and there's no update on phase 2 whatsoever that I'm aware of in actually coming forward in the future. We've got no guarantee about that whatsoever. And that calls into the viability of the whole scheme. I just find it concerning that we are in a time of huge increases within the building trade, and I can understand the fixed term being the preferred option. But I do have concerns over the figures in that most estimators that I've spoken to are looking at around about a 30% increase in costs. We're up against a possible recession. Today there's been comments in the press about a declining house sales and even house values, and that again affects greatly the viability of this scheme, in that if house prices drop and we value them at a set price and they go below that, again the viability of this scheme is called into question. So I suppose my question is, why was a director of the holding company, why was I not aware of phase 2A? That will do for now.
Okay, thanks. So that's quite a long-winded way of asking that question, but that's fine. Just to clarify, that the 2 phases have always been the renovation phase 1 and the new build phase 2.
The red outline area of phase 1 was a complete red outline. I think you'll find phase 2A is now within the original red outline of phase 1. So why is there a change in the delivery of that small area?
Okay, well,
why has that been not included in the phase 1 as always was intended?
It's just that the phase 2, the new build, has been split, but I'll let Emily clarify all of that again.
So yes, just to go back in terms of the phasing, the phasing was always to split it into the refurb of the existing buildings and the new build, so that's where the phase 1 and phase 2 came from. In terms of phase 2, this report is looking at phase 1 and seeking to increase the debt threshold to help deliver phase 1. Phase 2 potentially can be broken into 2 phases, 2A and 2B, but as the report sets out, there needs to be further assessment and review of the success of phase 1 before we make any commitments in relation to phase 2, whether that's 2A or 2B. So they are 2 separate sites. They could be split into 2 separate phases, or they could be delivered as one complete phase 2. So it's not set in stone that they will be delivered as 2A and 2B, but they are physically separate, and so for the purposes of the plan, I thought it might be helpful to see that, but also from a viability perspective, and in relation to the comments that Councillor Beer made earlier, they do have a different flood zone impact, and so we've started to look at them in those two different pieces. The report also sets out that from a viability perspective, delivering phase 1 and phase 2A does produce a break-even stroke small profit position, and both of those phases are deliverable without any further planning consents being required. So I thought it might be helpful for Cabinet and the councils to be able to see that there is a viable break-even scheme that can be delivered, whilst there may still be some outstanding points in relation to phase 2B.
Thank you, Emily. Councillor Holt again. Is there a follow-up question?
What concerns me, Emily, is that with all the data that I was provided at previous meetings, phase 1 was always turning into a loss. And with all the increasing costs, and the last time I had an update was December 21, with all the increasing costs, I just find it very concerning that we are now looking at a small profit. If we're relying on house sales to generate that profit, as I said earlier, I do find that quite a concern that we're going into a financial problem for the country as a whole, where we're looking at interest rate rises, decline in house sales, decline in mortgage letting, and if we're presuming to balance the books, this is going to happen, X, Y, Z on house income, we're going to be left with a heavy loss. We're probably £800,000 into this site already with security and other measures that have been spent. It's interesting in the papers, we're saying if house prices can't be maintained to what we think, then we'll absorb them in our housing stock. Well, that's all very well and good, but we're still not getting a return on that original investment by doing so. So, again, the question is, are we basing this on figures that the market is going to deliver, or are we just speculatively putting them out there?
Emily?
So the viability of schemes is assessed throughout the development programme. So the initial viability is based on cost estimates from QSs, along with market appraisals from estate agents, etc., in terms of what the sales figures are likely to generate. It's not something that stays static. Both costs and receipts can vary. The most recent appraisals that we've had, which are since the figures that you saw in December, Michael, have taken into account the fact that the works have actually been tendered. So we have fixed costs for the development of phase 1 as opposed to estimated or budgeted costs. And as I've said in the report, we are anticipating potentially a small loss or a break-even, depending on how much of the development contingency is required to be spent for this project. So at this point in time, we do believe that phase 1 will deliver a break-even, maybe a small loss, and that phase 2, particularly 2A, will deliver a profit. So overall, we're not looking at this scheme being a really profitable scheme. We're not delivering this scheme from a financial perspective, it being a kind of commercially viable scheme. This scheme has always been one which has had a challenging viability, and that was the case back in 2018 when this course of action was first agreed. So it is a challenging site from a viability perspective, but that's probably the reason why we as a council need to be involved in bringing it forward, because it's unlikely that a commercial body would be able to bring it forward. But at this point in time, we are looking at a break-even for phase 1, maybe a small loss. So from a viability perspective, yes, it's not going to show a huge profit, but as it's set out in the report in the appendices, there are wider returns that come back to the council if we bring this development forward.
Thank you, Emily. One last question or
I
point.
just want to come back on Emily really,
and then
because
I've
I
got to go
referred to
Councillor Dawson
December
next.
21, where actually we had 4 tenders in at that time. And my question, does phase 1, does the profitability include phase 2A that is clearly shown on the plan on our papers in front of us today for the cabinet meeting?
No, so in the papers, I'm very clear that phase 1 will be either a break-even or a small loss, but we're expecting phase 2A to deliver a profit. So I think we've been quite clear within the papers that phase 1 is potentially break-even or potentially a small loss, but there's the potential for that loss to be recapped through phase 2A. But that is very dependent on contingencies. If the contingencies within the development appraisal are not needed, then it could well be that phase 1 breaks even or potentially even makes a small profit.
But at no point in my paperwork that I've received as a director of the holding company was 2A clearly shown as a separate deliverable entity.
It doesn't need to be shown as a separate deliverable entity. It is part of the second phase. We've split it down, but it's still the same overall financial position. It's just we've split 2A and 2B into 2 different
Has it been
different
taken out of the
figures.
cost of phase
Chairman,
1?
can I just say,
Not in the cost of phase
this is
1.
like cross-examination of an officer, and I mean, I don't think that's the purpose of this session. A lot of the questions that Councillor Holt has asked, which I fully appreciate why he's asking them, but they could have actually been asked ahead of this afternoon.
Right,
we
okay.
shouldn't have a situation in Cabinet questions where we have an officer being cross-examined.
Excuse me.
Councillor Arthur,
I
I'm no
will-
QC, so I'm
can-
certainly not cross-examining.
Can everyone be quiet now, please? I've allowed Councillor Holt a certain amount of discretion here because he is a director of the holding company. However, we are in questions, and it's questions only. So the next person to speak will be Councillor Dawson. Do you have a question? And please make it a question before Cabinet moves into debate. You, Councillor Dawson.
Yes, I do, actually. Yeah, there's 2 questions, and the reason being is because, unfortunately, coming back to what Councillor Arthur, you know, as a member of the ward, one of the things I would say is none of us ward members have really been kept. I feel as if
Question, please, Councillor Dawson.
I feel as if, well, the questions I'd like to know why we've more or less sort of been gagged on this. We've had no information. I wasn't going to ask that question, but I mean, if you want to make it into a question, I'm disappointed that we didn't have more involvement on this project and had the opportunity to ask questions. So I will ask those now. Firstly, I don't know whether they should go to Emily or to Councillor Busby, but it is now concerning, there are a number of factors that I think new members on the Cabinet need to consider who weren't here when this was originally brought up 6 years ago. And the fact is a number of things have changed since the original decision was made. And one of those, for a start, is the flood risk. You know, my concern about this
Can you get to a question, please?
Yes, I
now.
can. Could you just give me a bit of leniency here? You're quite happy to do it to others, so I'd appreciate a bit of courtesy myself. The proximity of the site to the river imposes significant flood risk constraints and is now in a flood zone. So that being the case, how are we going to deliver 2B if it says at today's date it's in a flood zone? And we're expecting to use that to make the profit on phase 1. So these members will not have been made aware of that when it came up 6 years ago.
Okay.
Emily?
Can I just respond to that? Phase 2A is where the profit's going to be made, and we'll be reviewing phase 2B in terms of the flood and other assessments. Emily, would you like to pick up on Councillor Dawson's question, please?
Yes, so it is exactly that. So within this report, we're looking to bring forward phase 1, and that's why we need to increase the threshold. We have looked at phase 2 and split it, and we can deliver some of the profit from 2A, which would mean we've got a break-even or a small profit site. And what we've suggested within this report is that we look at phase 2B again as we progress through part of the development of phase 1, which will include looking at the changes to the flood risk in that area. So I agree with you, Councillor Dawson, we do need to review how we deliver phase 2B, but I do think that what this report is saying is that phase 1 and 2A can be delivered in a viable fashion.
2B is in a flood zone, and we had this all with the issue with McCarthy and Stone, which is bang next door. If that is in a flood zone, which it may well and is most likely, and the latest modelling has shown that, do you not think that that is a decision that affects whether we take on this increased loan threshold if this is not going to be delivered, phase 2B?
Councillor Dawson, the debt threshold is for the delivery of phase 1. Phase 2B is for the future.
Yes, but the point is if you're expecting to make a profit out of 2A and B
out
to
of
cover
1 and
phase
2A.
1, aren't you? Because we're not, as she said a number of times, we're break even or possibly make a loss. So what we're really hoping here, and you know, I more than anyone want to see this developed, I can assure you. But I would like to think, I'm sort of getting the impression here that the 2B is definitely going to be in a flood zone, and so I'm failing to understand how you think you could possibly make a profit.
The profit is on 2A.
Yes. Well, and 2B. It should be on 2B as well, because you're building 4 houses there. That is the point. It was meant to be making £450,000 6 years ago.
Okay.
Well, I'm
Councillor Dawson,
sorry.
do you have any other questions?
Okay.
Sorry,
well, I'm sorry.
Can I just come in?
Yes.
Councillor Busby, go on.
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
We're here really to discuss phase 1. 2B, we accept that there are issues that have arisen because of the change in flood zones, and we will have to reconsider what we do with that in the future. That shouldn't delay the decision on phase 1. We need to get on with phase 1.
I absolutely this development. To have something like this for 6 years sitting there like this is a truly, you know, quite shocking, really. You know, we need to consider a number of factors. Right, the car park. The building on the Bridge Lane car park goes against the long-term vision for Hadley, as you know. And despite the comments that were made at the last full council, you know, there is clear evidence in the strategic parking review, which I undertook. Hadley is well...
What is your question, please?
As I said, in the strategic parking review, Hadley has reached the threshold. So to build over an existing car park with 100 spaces, you know, the Cabinet, are they going to consider the fact that Persimmons plan to remain there for 8 years? Has that been taken into consideration by these new members?
But that's phase 2B again, which
I know,
is not what we're here to discuss today.
Well, I know, but the fact is, there's
Focus
so
on
many...
the point of which is phase.
Okay, everyone, can everyone stop now? Councillor Dawson, the car park, the strategic car parking review, you well know, does not show that there's a deficit of parking provision in Hadley, and in any respect, we're not here to discuss phase 2B, that site. We're here to...
I undertook the strategic parking
Councillor Dawson.
exactly what the figures are. So I don't know why
we are
wouldn't
now
want to mislead the
moving
public
into
on this.
Cabinet debate. Members of the Cabinet, no more questions. Members of the Cabinet. Questions at my discretion. If it's a question...
So again, you're gagging us. So we gagged from ONS, we're now gagged from your own questions. It's very good. This new independent coalition is working extremely well in gagging.
We're just going to pause the meeting for Okay, welcome back to the meeting, everyone. Sorry for that short delay. We've got still one or two more questions, I believe, before we go into Cabinet debate. Councillor Dawson, you had two questions.
Yes, now, my first question is, in February 2016, Carter Jonas undertook the initial soft assessment valuation of the site, and this was followed up with their employment viability. Now, their appraisal valued the site at 2.5 to 2.6 on one of the documents. Now, should the Cabinet, are they considering the informal marketing advice received in the paper today, which is £500,000, or should they be considering the formal advice originally by Carter Jonas? Because that, we might be better just selling the site at 2.5 million. But I think from what I'm understanding is you seem to think the value of the property has gone down from 2.5 to £500,000 in the last few years.
Thank you,
but that's
Councillor Dawson.
informal advice you've had.
Emily, can you clarify the differences in valuations?
I'm happy to come into that as you're asking the...
Yeah.
Oh, Councillor Boswell.
I do have a voice. Look, you're talking 6 years ago. Any valuation that was made 6 years ago is totally irrelevant today.
Should be higher.
Not necessarily. The 2.5, I don't know where the 2.5 million comes from, but the valuation would have included the whole site, which would have included 2B. These figures are as accurate as we can get them, given the fact that it's a fast-moving scene in terms of prices, house prices, resourcing, and everything else that goes with it.
Well, could I just suggest? Advice for this Cabinet paper, it says in here, is informal marketing advice of £500,000. And Carter Jonas did a formal report. So which of those two figures do you think might be nearer the truth?
Well, the one that's current and the one rather than the one that's 6 years old. I mean, it's not a difficult question, is it? You can go down any formal kind of study that you want. It takes time before we can get the information. Time is not something that we have abundance of at the moment. The longer we wait, the more prices go up, the more difficult it is to get a contractor to put a tender forward that they're happy to stick with. This is why it's time limited. This is why we need to make the decision today so that we can sign the tender for Friday, so that we can get started. If we don't do that, the prices will go up again, and the viability will get even worse.
Do you have another question, Councillor Dawson?
The other question I really wanted to ask was to do with, do you think we should continue working with the current partner when they were originally selected based on the fact they would be reasonably quick and would overcome the necessity for a lengthy procurement process, which it's been? And bearing in mind we're putting all the funding in, it has been lengthy, it has been costly. Do you believe that we should continue with this joint venture group with this partner?
I don't think changing horses in midstream is an option at the moment. No, definitely not. So yes, we should continue with NWES. Yeah. There have been delays. We all accept that, and we're not happy with them. None of us are happy with them. It started in 2016. Babergh growth weren't set up till 2019, so 3 years had passed before we even got on the case. 2019 saw the start of it, and really we kind of got on board, if you like, in autumn of 2019. What happened on 2020? We had COVID hit us. The discussions with the cricket club almost were impossible under those circumstances. And that, unfortunately, it's only a small factor, but it was a key one which delayed the whole process by about 18 months. And you're interrupting again. And you're still interrupting.
Councillor Dawson, you've had your questions. Councillor Barrett, do you have a question?
Yeah, my question is the Cabinet acting in an ultra vires way? Because I think this is a financial decision, and I think the financial position of any of the council's decisions like this of a significant amount, which is over 25,000, should really go to full council, where these budgets were approved. And also the amount, I mean, if it was in a budget heading and it was stayed within a budget heading, then yes, that can be done. But these figures are going across budget headings because they're not covered. So within the capital programme, there is a budget heading for the old headquarters building. There is also a capital project for regeneration, and there's also one for just capital expenditure general. You are inquiring to go into the regeneration fund, which was specifically set up by Emily Attack for the Hamilton Road project, and that Hamilton Road project is also coming forward, and that amount of money is being used for that. So really, you should be going back to full council for this, and it's not a cabinet decision because it's a financial one, a fiscal one. Also, the fact that this is upping the exposure to the council to a third party is also dubious as well, because the growth company, which is where you're loaning the money to, albeit a partner within the, is a third party. So I would say that you are on slightly dodgy ground in actually going down this road without going to full council. That's my question.
Thank you, Councillor Barrett. I will let the monitoring officer respond to that, as you're referring to the competence of the cabinet versus requiring the council to make a decision. But just one point: the regeneration fund in the budget is not specifically for Hamilton Road.
I think you'll find that it
Emily,
is.
would you like to respond to Councillor Barrett?
I think you'll find it is actually.
Thank you, Chairman. This decision is an executive decision, so therefore falls within the Cabinet's remit. The Cabinet is not restricted in terms of making financial decisions, i.e. there is no limit to the financial decision that the Cabinet can make, other than that it must be within agreed budgets, and the budget is obviously set by the full council. The Section 151 officer has confirmed that the funding for this is in the agreed budget, and therefore the Cabinet can make this decision. The only financial constraint that relates to Cabinet decision making is the £150,000 key decision threshold limit, which is another part of our executive decision making procedures. But it's fine to proceed at Cabinet with this decision, Chair.
Thank you, Emily. Did you have a supplementary question?
The fact is, which I think is slightly worrying, is the fact that because this is a grounds for urgency, it then becomes that the Overview Scrutiny Committee cannot call that in. Again, I think this all is slightly worrying of the way that this Cabinet is going forward without scrutiny.
That
wasn't a question, that's more of a statement.
I know it was, yes. But you are, I know you're well aware that the time constraints we've got on this, and that if we don't get an agreement by Friday, then we're back to square one with escalating costs. So this is all being done to keep control on those costs, and to make sure that we have something that we can proceed with finally for this site. Okay, we've now finished with questions. We're into Cabinet debate. Do any members of the Cabinet wish to comment on the paper in front of us? We have 6 options. We've extended the number of options and looking at others. So we've got a fully comprehensive list of options here in terms of what to do. And the recommendation clearly is option 2, to increase the peak debt threshold. The thing that we cannot do is essentially option 4, do nothing. For all sorts of reasons, not least of which the reference earlier about security costs. We do nothing, those will just continue to escalate. But doing nothing is no good for our reputation as a council, it's no good for this site, it's also no good for Hadley. The people of Hadley are always asking me, and indeed the people of neighbouring villages which I represent, when are we going to get on with it? They want to see something done. They know what we're proposing. They know we're proposing a really good housing development. And that is what they want to see, and they want to see it as soon as possible. They're appreciative of all of the problems we've been experiencing, but now is the time to make the final decision and go ahead and deliver on this site. Councillor McCraw.
Well, just to open the debate, Chair, the only option that is consistent with the decisions made in September 2016 by the full council, by the April the 2017 Executive Committee, some members of that committee are present here today, and the 2018 Babergh Cabinet and Council in setting up Babergh, although it wasn't known as that at the time. It was known as a commercial joint venture vehicle, and agreed the previous peak debt loan facility. This motion, part 2, proposes to increase that peak debt loan facility. In discussions prior to this, I've directly asked financial officers to make sure that we have the headroom to be able to afford and manage that debt within council budgets. They confirmed that that was the case. The only option that is consistent with the council's wishes in the past, as expressed in numerous votes, would be option 2. So if it hasn't already been proposed, I'd like to propose that option 2, as recommended here, and 3.1 and 3.2 be adopted so that we can get on with this by Friday.
Thank you, Councillor McCraw. Does anyone else wish to make any comments on this? Councillor Busby.
Yeah, look, I'm the last person that would like to continue with a project or a decision that was wrong. If we made the wrong decision in the first place, then I think the sooner you recognise it and come up with the right decision, the better. But the decision was made, and we have progressed along those lines. It was always based on housing until we spoke at the holding company board not long ago, and Michael suggested that we ought to look at a split phasing of it in terms of housing and business. I liked the idea of that. We looked into that. Unfortunately, it comes out as even worse position than using it all for housing. The objective of Babergh and this project hasn't changed from day one. It's to deliver a good quality, if not a very good quality, housing development for the benefit of Hadley, and to maximise the profits, minimise the losses for Babergh. That hasn't changed. It's the same in 2016, 2019 and 2022. The method of delivering those two objectives might have changed. The world is a significantly different place now than it was 3 years ago. The danger is if we don't do something now, it'll be significantly different in 12 months' time and we'll be even worse off. This is just a case of timing, that's all this is, and we need to get on with it.
Thank you, Councillor Busby. And we are in an unfortunate situation in that it is a complex site. There are listed buildings there. There are a number of other challenges. Unlike our colleagues in Mid-Suffolk, who were able to redevelop their former headquarters building quite easily, because it was a far less challenging site to do. Any other? Councillor Osborne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, Councillor Busby has said it very well and put it in plain facts for us to understand and for people listening to this meeting to understand it as well. What I will add to that is this Cabinet do not make decisions lightly. They look at all the facts, they look at their reports, they take into information that the officers are given to us, and we, as I say, it's been alluded to that perhaps we don't do that, and as in regards to new members on the Cabinet, I think that's undermining their intelligence. They're quite able to make those decisions. So, yeah, I fully support the recommendations in conflict to what they agree on the other side of the chamber. I think the discussion today the questions haven't added to the debate, they've deflected from it by 100 degrees. So I certainly support the recommendations. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Osborne.
Sorry, Chair, I think interestingly, I accept the questions and some of them were very valid, but you've not come up with an alternative which is viable. I think
we won't. We're not. This is.
We've had 6 years to come up with that.
Councillors, please, calm down. Calm down. We've got 6 options we've looked at. These are all the possible options. We've focused and come down on the only viable option here. Councillor Gould.
Thank you. As a new member of Cabinet, I would like to say that I fully appreciate that there's history to this and there are historic figures and perhaps baggage that's gone before. I can only say from where I'm sitting that I have been thoroughly supported by Emily and the other officers. I have been thoroughly supported on this particular issue by the briefings we've had. by the advice and support of my slightly longer in the tooth cabinet colleagues. And I am very, very familiar with looking at budgets of over £1 million. I'm very, very familiar at drilling down into reports, court reports, all sorts of reports. I'm very familiar with analysing data. And I feel thoroughly supported and do not have a problem with this report as it stands. And thank you to Emily for all you have done. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gould. Councillor McLaren.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Well, I too need to speak as a new Cabinet member. I've been very impressed with the information, but yes, a bit like Councillor Gould, I've come into this discussion late. Don't understand the history of it, but I too come from a background that understands budgets of a lot more than £1 million, and so I'm happy to go with the recommendation.
Thank you. If nobody wishes to say anything, Councillor Arthey.
Well, I'll just say one little thing, and that is, I don't know if Councillor Dawson remembers, but long-standing Hadley residents will doubtless remember the future of East House being uncertain for 20 years or so, and we don't want that to happen again.
No, we don't. And that has... Right, okay then, we'll now move to the vote, please, on this item.
Thank you, Chair. The vote is now in progress.
Disappointing you weren't here for the cost of living debate.
Chair, that is 7 votes for, that's unanimous.
Thank you. That brings today's meeting to a close. The next meetings, and I do stress meetings, are scheduled for the 5th of July at 9:30 and the 8th of July at 1 p.m. We've had to split into two due to the large agenda. But I'll thank everyone and see you at the next meeting next month. Thank you.